Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Meg Olson, and I am the Grassroots Mobilization Director here at Network. We are so excited to have you join us for our webinar today, Advancing Justice in the 118th Congress. Before we start, I'm just going to do a little tech housekeeping here. We do have closed captionings this evening, and they are available if you would like them. They are auto-generated and definitely imperfect, but you may turn them on by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. Towards the end of the webinar, we're going to have ample time for Q&A. Throughout the webinar, please type your questions into the Q&A box. This will allow us to follow up with you, especially if we need to give you more information. And if we don't have time to answer your questions during the webinar, we will be able to email you later. So here is our agenda this evening. We're going to do some ground setting, sharing our vision of a truly representative multiracial democracy. Then we'll have a broad overview of this 118th Congress. And then we're going to turn to our issues: economic justice, immigration, voting and election protections, and policing and sentencing. Then give you a sense of the journey ahead, what actions you're going to take. And then we'll have ample time once again for Q&A. And now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. This evening, we have Joan F. Neal, our Deputy Executive Director and Chief Equity Officer, Jarrett K. Smith, our Government Relations Advocate, Minister Christian S. Watkins, another Government Relations Advocate, Laura Peralta Schulte, Senior Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs, Renette Osser-Watham, Government Relations Director, and once again, I am Meg Olson, the Grassroots Mobilization Director. I'd also like to give a special shout out to my colleagues tonight on Grassroots Mobilization who are helping with tech, Colin Martinez-Longmore and Catherine Gillette. And now I'll pass it over to Network's Deputy Executive Director and Chief Equity Officer, Joan Neal. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Meg. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for this important look at what the 118th Congress has in store for our work for justice. Before my colleagues from Government Relations dive into all the wonky details about our policy priorities, I want to zoom out just a bit and look at the big picture to give us some perspective for why and how we do this hard work of shaping our federal policies. We write long policy updates, issue press releases, and ask you to contact your elected officials. Well, we do it because we have a vision, a shared vision of what our country and our communities could be. A vision of a multiracial democracy where everyone can thrive, where everyone is respected, and our politics serve the common good. This vision is consistent with our faith teachings and the values we hold, and we want to see that vision become our reality. Now, everything we do to influence Congress to minimize potential harms and secure wins where we can is critical. But as you listen to my colleagues explain what's at stake in this year's budget, the threats facing asylum seekers, the coalitions coming together to protect voting rights, and more, I invite you to consider this. What are the arguments against our priorities? What are the stories and the narratives that keep voters and elected officials from embracing the common good and common sense political policies that would bring us closer to being the truly representative, multiracial democracy we envision. Because, the point of our work, our lobbying, our statements, our rallies, and prayer vigils is to tell a different story, a more compelling, more sincere story, one that affirms our values as people of faith and as people of the United States. Now, I'm sure you can think of problematic narratives. Certainly, if you turn on C-SPAN, you'll hear them being used by some members of Congress to provide cover for harmful policy proposals. But I am also confident that we can push back against these narratives by showing people a better way forward as a country, a better way to build our country anew. And so the challenge ahead of us during the 118th Congress is to speak clearly, pointing out how damaging policies and proposals are incompatible with our values, and inviting others to join us in this work to advance more just policies and laws. One example of this that we have already done as a community is your actions to advance H.R. 40, the bill that would establish a commission on reparations. By naming our country's original sin of slavery in blogs and op-eds, by organizing vigils, online events, and webinars, and most recently by sending letters to President Biden, you have demonstrated publicly the importance of supporting a policy that lives up to our values of truth-telling, of reconciliation, and repair. And your visible witness for reparations is winning greater support for this policy. Now, while the short-term political outlook for establishing a reparations commission is challenging at this point, it is important that we keep working to bring people on board with our vision of a country that builds a stronger future by reckoning honestly with our past. And of course, the same goes for all of the other policy priorities that you're going to hear about very shortly, because we believe it is our duty as people of faith and members of this society to promote a different, more hopeful, more equitable vision of our country. One where all are respected, all are included, and all have equal opportunity to live and thrive. So to wrap up, I want to thank you again for your support of Network. If you find this webinar useful or the other tools and resources we provide, please consider becoming a member of Network. And if you are not already a member, if you are a member, please consider giving a donation so that we can continue doing the work that we do. We can do this work because all of you and your support. Thank you again. And let me turn it over now to my colleague, Jarrett Smith. Jarrett?
Thank you, Joan. Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to join you and talk about the newly elected 118th Congress and Network's issue agenda. But before we go into our issues, we need to spend a few minutes to talk about how we got here. On November 8th of last year, it was Election Day, commonly known as the midterms. Political pundits predicted Republicans would win large numbers in the House and Senate. There was even a name for the 22 election, the red wave. However, there wasn't much of a wave. You might call it a ripple in a puddle. Republicans did, though, gain a small majority in the House, a handful of seats, while Dems added one new Democratic member in the Senate. Weeks after the final election was called, the new Republican majority started the process to elect a new speaker. Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy was the favorite for the speaker position. Before the election, there was a profile on Mr. McCarthy, essentially giving him the nod that he would become the next most powerful Republican in the country. But there were some members of the Republican conference that had other ideas. It has been years since it took more than a couple votes before a speaker was elected. A very small conservative group of Republicans were able to extract their policy focus and create a new set of rules that govern the House administration. This was in exchange for their votes for Speaker McCarthy. This small coalition of Republicans is singing from a very different hymnal than the overwhelming majority of House Republicans and many, many Senate Republicans. Rough seas are ahead of us, but Network Lobby is ready. We are meeting with Republican members in the House and the Senate. A significant number of House Republicans represent districts President Biden won in 2020. In our work this Congress, we are also meeting with Senate Democratic leadership, senior administration staffers, and of course, Main Street Republicans in both chambers. If troubling legislation passes both the House and Senate, our advocacy will move to the West Wing of the White House, and we will press upon the administration's senior staff for the president to issue a veto and stop that legislation. Our work together, and that includes you, for the next 2 years can be summed up as defense. The government relations team has met and discussed since November our policy priorities. Our faithful discernment has led us to 3 issue buckets. You can see them on the screen. They are economic justice, immigration, democracy, and criminal legal system reform. My colleagues on the government relations team will say more about each area in the next few minutes. First up is Laura, who will discuss economic justice and the threat to programs like Medicaid, SNAP, and housing that we must work diligently to protect. Laura?
Thank you so much, Jarrett. And I just want to echo Joan and Jarrett and Meg's comment of how nice it is to be with you this evening. Our first big legislative challenge as it relates to our economic agenda is an issue that is probably one you're hearing about right now in the paper, lifting the debt ceiling. By law, there's a limit to how much the U.S. can borrow to pay our bills. This is typically a very non-controversial vote. For example, the debt limit was lifted 18 times during the Reagan administration, 8 times during the Clinton administration, and even 3 times during the Trump administration. And I bet you never read about it in the newspaper. There is zero relationship to it and our nation's fiscal health. Look, we've got to pay our bills. These are commitments made by both Democratic and Republican administrations. But now lawmakers are politicizing this issue and playing with fire. I don't often quote the Chamber of Commerce when I'm talking about an issue, but I think they sum it up best, frankly. They wrote a letter recently to the White House and to Congress saying it is impossible to overstate the negative consequences that would occur if the United States were to default on its debt. Most analysts believe this would result in an immediate recession with long-term negative consequences for our country. Next slide. My friends, we have been here before, and we cannot repeat history. For example, When Newt Gingrich became Speaker in 1995, he had that commitment for America, and part of that commitment was to cut spending. So he stalled passage of the debt ceiling to extract cuts. More recently, we faced a similar situation, a crisis, in 2011, when then Speaker Boehner, at the request of House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan, called for stalling passage of the debt ceiling in exchange for a demand to enact the Budget Control Act. The Obama administration was forced to go along with this. And what did that do? That bill implemented 10 years of cuts to vital human needs programs. Let's be clear also about one issue. When Republicans talk about debt, they are only looking at one side of the ledger, and that is spending. You never hear anything about debt or deficits when talking about tax cuts. You will recall that when Republicans passed the Tax Cut and Jobs Act in 2017, a bill that benefited their richest donors and large corporations, the words you never heard were debt or deficit. But that bill alone added $2 trillion of debt. Next slide. So what is at risk for our people? This is not a full list of what's at stake. We know they're going after climate. We know they're going after more, but we just want to make sure you see what we are thinking are some of the biggest threats, because they're parts of the budget where we spend the most money. I don't know if you enjoyed the discussion at the State of the Union between President Biden and some of the Republican members, jousting over cuts to Social Security and Medicare. That produced almost an immediate reaction, and it appears, at least for now, that House Republicans have taken those programs off the chopping block. We will be vigilant, but that's not where we think they're going at this point. What we have seen are proposals to slash healthcare programs. They are talking, once again, just like we fought back in 2017, about significant cuts to Medicaid. They are talking about cuts to the CHIP program. They are talking about tax cuts that help people pay for coverage that we passed in the Inflation Reduction Act. That was your work, that is on the line. In terms of housing, they are calling for cuts to public housing programs like rental assistance and homeless assistance, which puts hundreds of thousands of households at risk for eviction and homelessness. They want to cut the voucher program. They want to cut food. And again, both in this bill and in the Farm Bill, this is the call: cut SNAP, cut SNAP. They even have bills and proposals coming out of the House Budget Committee, which would cut WIC, that would deny access to infant formula, fresh fruits, vegetables, removing 1 million people from that program. What this agenda calls for is making people sicker, making them live more hungry, and making them live homelessly. And that is unjust. Next slide. My friends, we must fight back. We must call for a clean debt ceiling bill. It is immoral for Congress to balance the budget on the backs of women and children, of struggling families, and at the risk of our communities. That is the work ahead for us. We must show Congress, particularly the members that Jarrett mentioned earlier, those with good hearts, with good intentions, that the way forward that our values are calling us to is not to cut programs for the most vulnerable that help them thrive. If Congress is serious about debts and deficit, and to me that is a very, very big question, there are ways to address it, much like President Biden did when he put he called back some of the tax cuts, asking the wealthy to contribute in the Inflation Reduction Act. That bill alone significantly brought down the deficit. So that's what we are calling for. If you want to deal with this, raise taxes on the wealthy and corporations so that they pay their fair share. If you're looking for budget cuts, look no further than the waste, fraud, and abuse in the Pentagon or the immoral funding for border militarization that Renette is going to reach on. We need your help. We need your help, and we'll be back. Now I have the pleasure of turning over the program to Renette.
Thank you, Laura. So we will speak about immigration. For immigration, the 118th Congress is all about the 2024 election. It is a platform for the 2024 election, and each vote and each action will be used in some sort of ad in the campaign when it comes to that. Everyone is focused on that when they're talking about immigration. The House is setting up itself for the 2024 election by holding as many hearings as it can to build a case against Secretary Mayorkas, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, and tie that to President Biden. Since the 1st of February, we have had a hearing on immigration almost every week in all sorts of committees, including the Energy Committee. And we've also had hearings in Texas and Arizona. These hearings spew constant misinformation. Last Tuesday, a sheriff in Arizona swore under oath that asylum seekers get benefits of $800 a month. I wish that was true. Unfortunately, it is a lie. These hearings also generate a lot of white nationalist conspiracy theories and hate. Just this Tuesday, a sitting member of the US Congress called a witness a lab experiment. And that was one of the nicer things that was said at that hearing. The Senate is also focused on the elections, but in a different way. The Senate Democrats are divided. We have some very strong advocates for immigration, like Senator Padilla and Senator Booker and Senator Menendez, but we have others who feel that the only way to success in the 2024 election is to show a tough stance and militarize the border even more than it is now. The Republicans and the independent senator from Arizona, Senator Sinema, who is up for re-election in 2024, agree. The more militarization at the border, the better. There have been many visits by both senators and House members this year. However, there have been many visits to the border by senators and House members this year. However, the problem is that both Democrats and Republicans spend more time with Customs and Border Protection officers than border communities, our own sisters and brothers, our own bishops. They don't meet them as much. Therefore, for them, the border communities look more like the bottom picture, a militarized version of the United States. Border communities themselves, however, see the border as the top picture. Here you see a family that has just returned from Mexico after taking their dog to the vet. Border communities do not want militarization at their border. Therefore, our meta goal this year is to change the narrative on immigration in order to keep and pass good public policy. Next slide, please. As in all our advocacy, we center the people who have been the most adversely affected by policy. So for the 118th Congress, we'll be focusing on the asylum seeker population and the DACA dreamer population. When I say the asylum seeker population, it won't be simply asylum seekers at the border, but asylum seekers who come to live and arrive in cities, as well as those who are detained. And we will be working on detention as well. And we will have a special focus on Black and Indigenous asylum seekers because of the extreme discrimination that they face. In my reading of the world map, there are many countries between the United States and Ukraine. Yet never once have I ever heard a US officer of the state, a US member of Congress, question and ask why Ukrainians do not stay closer to home or seek asylum in a third country instead of coming to our southern border. In April of last year, 20,000 Ukrainians were at our southern border, and they were processed through one port of entry in a week. When we know we can process asylum seekers in an orderly and quick manner, but we choose to only process in that fashion only one group of asylum seekers and not others, that is discrimination. Next slide, please. In terms of legislation, as it was said before, it's defense, defense, and more defense. Right now, the bulk of the law that governs immigration is a law that comes out of the civil rights era, the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1964, known as the INA. It clearly states that people have the right to seek asylum in the United States, regardless of the way they enter. The law specifically says a person does not have to come to a port of entry to have the right to seek asylum. And even people found at sea and brought to the mainland have the right to seek asylum. So our work is to ensure that the INA is not changed for the worse. We will also preclude the Congress this year, especially through appropriations, sending more funds to the border through the CBP. And then we will work on protecting Dreamers and DACA recipients. The Bipartisan DREAM Act of 2023 has been introduced in the Senate by Senators Durbin and Graham. This DREAM Act is slightly watered down from the other DREAM Acts of the past. It only allows for conditional permanent residence for the first 8 years. But it still does have a lot of protections for DACA recipients and Dreamers. And given that the courts at the moment look like they may even gut the DACA program even further, any protections are good protections. We support this bill and await the introduction of the House bill. So that is a snapshot of our work on immigration, on what our work on immigration will look like on the 118th Congress. And with that, I will pass to my colleague, Christian.
Thank you, Renette. And thank you to you all for tuning in with us. Greetings from Washington, D.C. It's great. I'm grateful to still be working with you all. As my colleagues have previously stated, there's a lot of heavy-hitting critical legislation to consider and significant resistance happening to assure that progress that has been made for the past 2 years will not be lost, both on the Hill, with the administration, and across the nation. Thank you for being an informed and engaged resource for network throughout all these years. Your work with our DC office and back in your various local and state areas has been critical to making justice happen. Although it's a lot, and I do mean a lot of information to wrap your heads around, let alone to act on. Please don't lose faith. Like Martin Luther King once said, there's always a right time to do what is right. Now, in regards to voting and election protections, due to the congressional composition and the conservative House leadership, we don't anticipate any freestanding democracy reform bills to pass this Congress. However, we do anticipate negative messaging bills and attack amendments through must-pass legislation like appropriations, the Farm Bill, the NDAA. Republican lawmakers are resolved to being focused on oversight, intent on criminalizing voting and elections administration processes, and curbing popular mail-in voting methods. In order to realize the promise of American democracy, we need bold, transformative reforms that would reduce the influence of big money in politics, ensure our freedoms to vote, and guarantee that congressional districts are drawn to give fair representation for all. Beloved, you know, together we can realize a democracy that represents, reflects, and responds to all of us. But until Congress can come to sensible and equitable consensus on passing necessary reforms, President Biden must take executive actions to do everything in his power to strengthen our freedoms to vote and protect our democracy. So as far as administrative goals are concerned, we will be making sure that the March 7th, 2021 Voting Access Executive Order is fully implemented with all of the protections and provisions across the government agencies. Just today, the Leadership Conference released a progress report of 10 Biden-Harris federal agencies and how they've made progress in implementing their plans to expand voting access. The report shows that while a few agencies have made noteworthy progress to complete implementing their recommendations by the end of 2024, most have either made minimal progress on their initial strong commitments or have left important opportunities on the table, being at risk of not achieving the president's goals. The Leadership Conference's report estimates that if the 10 identified agencies integrate a high-quality voter registration opportunity for the people that they serve, as recommended by the Leadership Conference's report, they could collectively generate an additional 3.5 million voter registration applications per year. Talk about it closing the voting access gap. Also, we will be advocating for an executive order on the Disclose Act. That executive order would require disclosure of political expenditures made by government contractors. It would fight dark money in politics, exposing the influence of billionaires and corporations in our system. So as far as our advocacy goals are concerned, that's where you all come in, and that's where my work continues. Senate defense work, we will be employing Senate defensive work to thwart bad bills. The main Democratic defensive priorities will include counter oversight, assuring the January 6th investigation and all other voting rights oversight activities are not lost, and providing robust evidence for voter integrity in past and upcoming elections. We will also fight for progressive amendments to end the must-pass legislation, like the appropriation process and the NDAA and so forth. Our overall goal is an all-in offensive work to protect existing voter laws against attack, calling for the protection of election integrity, and pushing for the advancement of critical reform bills like the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act and the Disclose Act, all to the end of building consensus for the 119th Congress, when we might have a better chance, when we prayerfully will have a better chance of getting these reform bills passed. After all, as my colleague Renette said earlier, we're in election season for 2024, and we've still got work to do until executive orders and good reforms are codified into law by congressional action. Next slide, please. As far as policing and sentencing is concerned, our criminal legal system reform, we will be expecting significant resistance in the House through the judiciary and other committees of jurisdiction to policing and sentencing reform and restoring voting rights to the formerly incarcerated. For our administrative goals, we will ensure full implementation of President Biden's Safer America plan and other actions. Most notably, the May 25th, 2022, Advancing Effective Accountable Policing and Criminal Justice Practices to Enhance Public Trust and Public Safety Executive Order. Alongside our criminal legal system reforms, coalition members and working groups will continue to push for full implementation of the reforms outlined in the executive order. And in regards to the Equal Act that you all fought so fiercely for over the past couple of years, after it failed being included in the NDAA this past year, 1 minute it was in, a couple of hours late in the midnight hour, it was out. Attorney General Merrick Garland made sure to issue a directive on December 16th, 2022 to all federal prosecutors to make sure that they are not going for blood, but going for the equitable sentencing guidelines or sentencing opportunities for those that are convicted of cocaine and crack felony convictions. So our efforts will be to hold the Attorney General office accountable while still pushing for the Equal Act and sentencing reforms. Like I said before, we've still got work to do until the executive orders and good reforms are codified into law by congressional action. So our advocacy goals for this year will be focused on Senate defensive work to thwart bad bills that come up in the Senate and from the House, and major defensive resistance in the House to thwart continued bad, tough on crime, militarization legislation, and continuing to push for robust reforms. Together, we will still be advocating for the Equal Act, sentencing package reform bills, marijuana reform bills, and others. Our priorities will continue to be faithfully advocating for relief to those convicted for minor drug offenses by reforming sentencing laws. And together, we will still be demanding police reforms and fighting against carte blanche giving police forces funding and more military-grade equipment without significant accountability measures to protect communities from hyper-militarization and supporting evidence-based solutions to policing. When the bills drop, when I hear that the critical reform legislations are introduced in their respective chambers and are ready for action by you all, no doubt you'll hear from me. So stay tuned, stay educated and engaged in the other priority areas we've outlined. And I look forward to seeing y'all in action when time comes. And now I'll pass it off to Meg to lead us on the journey ahead.
Thank you so much, Christian. And just wow, thanks to Joan and Jarrett and Laura and Renette. And once again, Christian, for taking us through so much legislation and painting these broad strokes so that we know what we're doing for the next, through the first session of the 118th Congress. I just want to remind you, our website and our social media are both full of additional resources. We have our legislative update blogs that I encourage you to read. I'll be sending some of those along in a follow-up email so that you can read more carefully about some of these policies that my colleagues have talked about tonight. We also, as some of you know, we've launched our second season of our podcast that is produced by US Catholic called Just Politics. And we definitely make sure that the episodes that come out every other week are following the arc of our legislative work. So you'll get to hear from other experts and faith leaders on these and personal stories on these important legislative issues. So next week, before I get to that, as Joan said at the beginning of our webinar, we have to tell a different story. And we do that through our advocacy, to dismantle systemic racism, build an inclusive community, root our economy in solidarity, and ultimately transform our politics. And next week is a big week for us to begin our advocacy. First, on March 9th, you will receive an action alert inviting you to submit a comment to the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice on the asylum ban that we heard about earlier this week that was given from the Biden administration. You will have 2.5 weeks to submit your comment, but I encourage you to start writing now while Renette's information is fresh in your mind. In order for your comment to be read, over 1/3 of it must be unique. And in this action alert, Network will provide you with the right talking points and some good, strong language, but it's up to you to bring in your faith, your personal stories if you've been to the border, your moral voice. And so I encourage you, you can start drafting those thoughts now. And then once you get the action alert next Thursday, a week from today, then you can plug in Network's talking points and then be able to send it off to the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. March 9th is a busy day because also on that day, President Biden is releasing his budget. While there won't be any major action you need to take, please know that this is then the official kickoff of our economic justice work, that work that Laura spoke about at the beginning. And we will need all hands on deck, everyone here and beyond, to ensure that we get a clean debt ceiling and don't balance our budget on the backs of working families and those who are struggling and marginalized. And it's important to remember in this work to keep on keeping on. First, I want to thank you. Today is only March 3rd of this year. And so far, you have delivered the 2022 voting record, prayed our reparations prayer, sometimes daily during Black History Month, observed Ash Wednesday with us and learned more about slavery and the Catholic Church and reparations, and most recently wrote letters to President Biden about the need to uphold his executive order to establish a commission on reparations. You have already done so much this year. So it's important to remember two things, justice seekers. You are all so powerful. You bring your faithful and moral voice to your members of Congress, and that helps us here in DC at Network and beyond to our coalition partners to advance our Build a New agenda. And even though my colleagues laid out a pretty sobering defensive strategy, as Jarrett said, it's defense, defense, defense all year, I know that you will help us stay hopeful. And I hope that in community, you help each other stay hopeful. Because building God's kingdom is long haul work. Yes, we have a lot of work to do this 118th Congress, especially in this first session. But we know, right? Christian's already saying 119th. We know, right, the journey ahead. So just thank you for everything that you've already done in the first, 12 weeks of the year and the work that you're going to continue to do. So now I'd like to bring up all of my colleagues, Laura, Jarrett, Renette, Christian, because we already have some questions that people have been typing in, and I'm sure we'll get a few more as the conversation continues. So this question is for Laura. So we know that people's ability to invest in their values by learning about eco-friendly businesses could be thwarted if the House and Senate bill prohibits President Biden's rule that allows investment companies to share with their clients information about companies' effects on the environment. Is Network involved in this at all, or is there anything we have to worry about, Laura?
So I just want to, Tom, I really appreciate your question, because you, like so many who are on this call now, are so engaged in the process that you have one of the most sophisticated questions as the first question. So so you probably know that that bill was voted on today. It did pass. And we do know that the president will veto that. I think that is a great example of the danger ahead for us. As Jarrett pointed out and Renette also pointed out, 2024 is a very bad year for Senate Dems. You've got a lot of folks that are in very red states or purple states. And so you're going to see them go back and forth on numerous issues in terms of whether they, from our perspective, do the right thing, or whether they succumb to political pressure because they're afraid of an ad running. So I will say this bill, while the president vetoes now, will come back. We are going to see mischief all year long. The question you're asking about is network working on it. I think you know that we are moving into the environmental space, still discerning what pieces and parts we will be in. Frankly, it is really important for consumers to understand risk, and climate is one of the biggest risks you have on the stock market. So it's a common sense rule. It should be non-controversial. And really, we will be back as we discern where we sit in the climate space and what issues. But this is one that just makes sense, and we'll be looking out because this and other mischief will be back.
Thanks so much, Laura. I have another question for you. This, of course, is one of our field's favorite issues that they love to work on, and we're anticipating this question. So, what are the prospects? Are we going to be able to pass an expanded child tax credit this year?
Oh my gosh, you are singing the music that I live by, my friends. We cannot deal with that first thing, but it is very likely that we will have a tax bill this year. There is a unrelated tax bill related to the FAA that expires at the end of September. And so that will be a vehicle for tax if it can come together. I think where I see hope and where I hope we remain hopeful is the new chairman, all these members who are chairs on the House side. We've got to meet with them and encounter them to see where they are on issues. He just put out a press release saying that the child tax credit is something he's very interested in and wants to move forward. We don't know what that means, but that means there's hope. So even in what we are describing as a defensive, bleak situation on many of our issues, and I don't want to understate that, there is hope there. We will be back to you later on this issue. We can make progress this year. Child poverty is a sin, and we've got to remind members that they need to do the right thing. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Laura. I'm sure others were thinking it too, so they're grateful. Okay, Jarrett, this one is for you. Obviously, we know we have a lot of challenges ahead with the House. And yet, you mentioned like Main Street Republicans and different things. So are there different approaches with different House members this year, even on the Republican side?
Well, as a team, and we're also working with our faith coalition partners. What we're doing is, it doesn't matter if you're the Democratic side, Republican side, you create these caucuses. And the Republicans have created what is called the Main Street Caucus. And they are more traditional Republicans. A number of them were won in Biden districts. So it is our strategy to reach out to these Republicans and also talk to Republicans in the Senate, like Susan Collins, to make sure that they understand what is really at stake with some of these proposals that this very, very conservative group of Republicans has put forward. The part of the issue is the Republicans only have 222 House seats, right? And that's not a large number, right? So, they can only lose a couple if they want to move legislation forward. So we are going to work with those people, doesn't matter what side of the aisle, whose ideals and mission is in line with network and our members' mission. So we are just, we're strategizing every day as a team. We try to read the tea leaves. We look at what, members are saying, just like Laura mentioned, just like Christian and Renette mentioned. And we try to, take all this information. We think about it, and we talk to our coalition partners and see if there are members that we can reach out to and work with that can, stop some of this bad legislation, but also if there is an opportunity like the CTC, we can move some good things forward.
Thanks so much, Jarrett. Yes, there is always a way forward. And I think, our faith coalition partners, we're good at working across the aisle. And so I think there is a little room for hope, especially in the Senate. All right, Christian, the questions about democracy are flying, and I know we only have a few minutes left, so we might not get to all of them. But okay, will the executive order be enough to protect voting access? It seems like there are so many states that are, limiting voting access and trying to prevent voting. So,
Well, like I said, the executive order can only go so far. It's mainly for federal elections, but there is significant work happening all across the country in states and cities in regards to reforming voting laws in their respective areas. So while things are floundering here on Capitol Hill as far as robust reforms that are needed in order to codify voting rights and election security and making it easier, making it more effective to vote, especially for urban communities as well as indigenous areas, lands throughout the nation. I strongly encourage you to get in contact or to become informed as to what local and state laws are actually being reformed and are being advocated for, and make those efforts on the ground happen, so that when time comes, robust reforms can be justified and made here in Congress, here on Capitol Hill. So like I said, while the executive orders only go so far, there's more work that can be done on the local and state level. And then when time comes, there will be opportunity to make those reforms here on Capitol Hill.
great, thank you. One more voting rights question. Is there a bill that would appoint an independent group to create the voting districts so that we can get rid of gerrymandering?
As of right now, I'm not aware. So if anyone knows of anything, or if the person who asked that question knows of anything, please don't hesitate to email me at cwatkins@networklobby.org. And I'd love to talk with you about it, find out what you know, and to get on board with the movement. However, gerrymandering is a very pervasive issue throughout the nation. And we know that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, Restoration Act would actually combat those gerrymandering situations, those situations that gerrymandering has become a problem. We know that there are some Supreme Court cases that are on the books right now that are being heard and decided. And we're waiting to see how the courts respond to those petitions. However, as of right now, again, the state and local legislations, robust legislations are being introduced and debated all across the country in states and municipalities. So stay tuned, get engaged in that work, and you'll definitely hear from me once the bills drop here on Washington, here in Capitol Hill, and we'll move forward together.
Great, thanks so much, Christian. All right. I think that is all the time we have for Q&A at the moment. But thank you so much, everyone. I know there's still a few questions that we didn't get to answer, and I will pass those along to my colleagues, and we will make sure you receive an email with that answer. All right, so just remember to stay connected. Our info ad at Network Lobby is staffed by actual live network colleagues who will answer your questions. We are on Facebook, we are on Twitter, we are on Instagram, so find us at your favorite social media. And finally, echoing what Joan invited you to do at the beginning of this webinar, if you appreciate this webinar and all of the educational resources and policy updates and appreciate Network, I do encourage you to become a member. It is $50 a year or $20 for students and limited income folks. And for your membership, you get all 4 issues of Connection. And you get to really support your work and say, I'm a member of Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. So definitely go to our website and find out how you can become a member. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope we got you ready and excited and thinking about how you're going to join us in our advocacy work on this 118th Congress to advance justice. Thank you, Joan and Jarrett and Laura and Renette and Christian once again, and behind the scenes in tech, Colin and Catherine. All right, have a wonderful night, everyone. Thank you.